Your brain is a pretty amazing thing. It only weighs about 3 pounds, but everything you think, feel, and do happens because of it. What if there were a way to learn about how it works while building your own brain circuits, almost like Legos for the nervous system? These are NeuroBytes, electronic neuron simulators that allow you to do just that. In your real nervous system, there are 3 general types of neurons. Sensory neurons have receptors that bring information from your environment, like touch and light, into the brain and spinal cord. Motor neurons send messages out to the muscles and glands. And interneurons, also called relay neurons, are the ones connected in between your sensory and motor neurons. They are involved in simple spinal cord reflexes, which you'll build in an upcoming experiment, as well as more complicated brain circuits. There are NeuroBytes that work like these neurons too. We'll focus on the interneurons first. Like real neurons in your brain, the interneuron simulators contain some pretty special parts. Just like trees have lots of leaves on them to receive sunlight inputs, neurons can have lots of dendrites on them to receive information inputs from other neurons, sometimes thousands of dendrites per cell. To keep it simple, your interneuron has 4. Neurons also have a cell body area that contains things common to other cells, like a nucleus with DNA in it, ribosomes for protein production, and mitochondria for energy production. The neuron cell body is unique in that it collects electrical signals from the dendrites and computes whether or not those signals will be allowed to continue on. If they do, the axon strengthens them using something called action potentials and passes them on down to the end of the cell, called the axon terminal. Neuroscientists also use other words, such as spike or impulse, for the action potential. Think of a fuse running towards a stick of dynamite. The burning of the fuse in one direction away from where it was lit is the action potential. When the axon terminal receives the action potential, it plays a neat little magician's trick to pass that impulse on to the next neuron. Since neurons aren't usually physically connected, electricity cannot normally flow directly between neurons. The axon terminal takes the incoming electrical spike and turns it into a chemical signal. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and they are released into the really tiny space between neurons called the synaptic cleft. In the dynamite analogy, this is like the burning fuse reaching its end and causing an explosion of released neurotransmitters. You won't use chemicals with your neuron simulators, but you can model communication between presynaptic, before the synaptic cleft, and postsynaptic, after the synaptic cleft, neurons using neurotransmitter cables. Red cables simulate excitatory neurotransmitters, which increases the chances that the postsynaptic cell will get excited enough to fire an action potential, while blue cables simulate inhibitory neurotransmitters, which decrease the chances that the postsynaptic cell will fire an action potential. We use the terms pre- and postsynaptic neurons because there is directionality in the nervous system. Again, similar to the fuse and dynamite analogy, one of the important rules that our nervous system and NeuroBytes follows is that information typically only flows one way within cells, from dendrite inputs to axon terminal outputs, as well as between cells, axon terminal outputs to dendrite inputs. So, when you connect your NeuroBytes together, they cannot be connected axon terminal to axon terminal or dendrite to dendrite. Real neurons can't usually talk to each other that way, and neither can your NeuroBytes. NeuroBytes are electronic neuron simulators, so they must have a power source. In your real cells, the mitochondria is the power source. For NeuroBytes, it's your battery pack. The battery pack, which may look a bit different than this one, and power cable get connected to the large 7-pin connector found on any of the NeuroBytes neuron simulators. As you connect more NeuroBytes together into circuits, they will share power through the neurotransmitter cables, so only one power source is needed. One important note before you power your neurons up for the first time. The connectors on the power and neurotransmitter cables click in easily and are held in place by a tab, shown here. To remove the cables, you must pinch the tab with your finger and thumb before pulling the cable out. If it does not come out easily, try pinching again before pulling the cable out to avoid damaging it. Now, if you haven't already, take out your battery pack and black power cable and connect it to one of your interneurons. When you connect your battery pack, which we will represent from now on with this power button icon, you'll notice the LED lights up. This is telling you that your interneuron has power, but something more important too. The color of the LED is telling you how excited your neuron is. The green light is telling you that your neuron is at rest. That makes sense because nothing is stimulating it. Just like neurons in your real brain, NeuroBytes neuron simulators need input to do something. First, we'll experiment with your red excitatory neurotransmitter cables. There are touch receptors in your skin that work sort of like little switches, and these receptors send action potentials along sensory neurons to your brain to let you know that you've been touched on some part of your body. We'll use one of the touch sensory neurons from your kit to simulate a touch and activate your interneuron. Connect one end of a red cable to any of the touch sensory neuron outputs, and the other end to one of the longest interneuron dendrites, number 2 or number 3. What happens when you give the touch sensory neuron switch one click? This is kind of like a touch on your skin, so soft your brain doesn't really notice it. What happens when you give it 2 or more quick clicks? This is kind of like a touch strong enough that your brain does notice it. Now, disconnect the end of your neurotransmitter cable connected to the interneuron by pinching the tab and pulling the cable out. Reconnect it to one of the short interneuron dendrites, number 1 or number 4. Now what happens when you give your touch sensory neuron switch one click? There are a couple things you hopefully learned here. First, as your interneuron got more excited, the LED changes colors. Green means that the interneuron is at rest, red means that it's getting more excited but not yet enough to send an impulse, and the white flash you saw meant that the interneuron fired an action potential. Like we've said before, this fuse burning will cause an explosion of released neurotransmitters. Secondly, you may have realized that the longer the dendrite in the postsynaptic neuron, the more clicks, or the more energy, is needed to fire an action potential in that neuron. Dendrites are electrically leaky, kind of like a garden hose with holes in it. Dendrites in your brain really act like this, minus the water of course, and this leakiness is important for learning and memory, which you will experiment with coming up soon.